thank you very much, Maria, and indeed SCOTEN's committee for inviting me again. I addressed SCOTEN's back in 2012 and found my keynote PowerPoint, which was quite naive. Well, that's much better. Thank you, whoever's done that. To focus at that time on creativity and developing creative teachers. I'm with Mark in believing that the profession is going to be enriched and is continually enriched by the professional development and understandings of our teachers and therefore of our student teachers. And today I've taken the focus of developing reading teachers. I believe reading teachers can give us hope. I believe they already do. I know several who are not only giving us hope as educators, but the young people hope by shifting the agendas in that way. Because as we all know, reading for pleasure, choosing to do so, is the single most important indicator, as the OECD articulate for us, of where our children will be, where they're going. That slide doesn't say being able to read, it says choosing to do so. Choosing to be that avid, enthusiastic reader. Reading for pleasure is choosing to do so. And clearly, as we all know, well, many of you, I'm sure, are hugely aware of it, and I'll go through some of those benefits later, that reading for pleasure, choosing to do so, is a mediator both of gender and of socioeconomic disadvantage. So that sense of delivering social justice, which is after all a shared responsibility we have as institutions and individuals working towards greater fairness for all, is enabled or supported by this focus on reading for pleasure. The emphasis of my talk, at least on social justice, is a deliberate attempt to foreground the collective and the shared alongside that sense of the individual. We collectively own responsibility to move this further forward, increasing fairness, dignity and worth for all folk. So what am I drawing on? A range of studies over the years in this particular talk that relate to reading for pleasure, and in particular drawing on a study that's undertaken over 3 years for student teachers as readers and their development. My trajectory in this talk is threefold. I want to explore initially the potential power of reading for pleasure. I want to then focus more on our student teachers as readers, and then I want to develop the argument about ways forward about developing these enhanced professionals who explore that link between being a reader in my life and being a teacher of reading in my professional life, and that kind of interplay between the two. Now, I'm very conscious that many of you here are not English specialists. You're not supporting the literacy course within your institution. You're supporting a wide range of other strands of development and are responsible more generally. But I want to try and make a segue each time and ask you to make a segue with me into the context that you're working in. Reading is powerful right across the curriculum in any case, but equally, if you're sitting there as a geographer, subject specialist geography or whatever, subject specialist religion and religious studies, then there are parallels to be understood, I would argue, about the personal in the professional. We chose as educators to specialise in particular areas within the primary curriculum or indeed within secondary. There was a personal passion potentially within that choice that has then been developed over the years. And so I'm going to be inviting you to try to find the parallels and provide pauses for you both as readers but also as thinkers and with subject specialisms as we travel. Just to clarify a few terms before we get going, I'm going to read a story to move us forward. Reading for pleasure, well, what is it? The ILA suggests it is reading freely, voluntarily, and with delight. Nobody's going to check, nobody's going to ask for questions. You chose to do it, and you chose what it was you were reading. It can involve any kind of text, of course. It could be on your phone, and it could take place anywhere, and it isn't on your own necessarily. It could be 2 or 3 of us looking at the newspaper results, or 2 of us sharing a story in the corner of the classroom because it's a funny story and there are jokes in it, and I want to share it with Nathan. So that sense of reading for pleasure is not a solitary act, but of course, as we all know, it's hugely dependent on the text that you're reading and the context you're in. And as Mark referred to, we need teachers who are therefore able to flex both the text and the context with effective consequence for the young. In terms of reading teachers, I would argue that all of our teachers, whatever age and phase they're teaching, are teachers of reading. They're supporting reading within the discipline that they're exploring, but only some of them become those enhanced professionals who are highly agentic, highly reflective, and think about their own identities as readers, or indeed their identities as geographers or mathematicians, and then explore the young people's identities. Reading is, or learning in education is a space of identity relationships. So a space of education, as we well know, is based on relationships. So we need to know who we are and who the young people are and what their dispositions are towards these different aspects in order to build, progress, and offer more socially just experiences within school and beyond. In our own work and those of others, we've seen that reading teachers, those who exploit those multiple identity positions, begin to impact more on young people choosing to read. So I believe there's hope in a position which takes us more to be a personal stance within education alongside the professional requirements and competencies and compliances needed. So we need more balance, I would argue, at least in the context which I've worked in. I've argued for more balance between the knowledge and the skills, but also that sense of identity positioning, so that we give our young student teachers both the opportunity to develop competencies and be compliant within the system, but also to develop their own agency and possibilities for all young. You can see where I'm coming from as a kind of stance, at least. I hope you're beginning to think there may be something in this, but I'm not sure I agree with her yet. Well, I'll try and persuade. But what I'd like to do now is move on to a story. And the story is called, subtitle actually, A Story of Hope. So I'm just going to pause for a moment and ask you to think about your family. Your family. Not your work, your family. What do you hope for in the next 5, 10 years? For those young people, very young, older, what are your hopes? Wisp, A Story of Hope by Zana Fralin and Graham Baker Smith. Idris lived in a small, small world, a world where fences grew from the dirt and where shadows ruled. A world with no trees to give shade, no rivers to drink or seas to swim, a world full of people, but where everyone was alone. Until one day, a wisp flew in on the evening wind. Dust rose up in swarms around it. Feet trampled it into the dirt. Nobody noticed it. Nobody except Idris. Idris gentled the wisp from the ground. He softened away the dust and the dirt and the footprints, and that was when he felt it, the smallest whisper of want. The wisp began to wriggle, fluttering and flittering. It bustled Idris past rows of tents, over the moonlit dirt, and along the fence's glare, until it stilled at the feet of a man, ancient and cracked. "Is this yours?" Idris asked. The man's eyes were long ago dulled, but he took the wisp in his hand. He held it to his ear, and slowly the spark of a smile lit his lips. "Once," he whispered. The wisp pulsed bright, and the man lifted his voice, and music poured into the night. A swelling sea of rememberings twirled on the air and shimmered in the breeze. The people stopped. They smiled, and together they listened to the blazing bright heartbeat of a song. And when the man's voice quietened, there was just a hint of a hum in his step, and the bright in his eye where the dullness no longer settled. When the next wisp flew in on the evening wind, Idris knew what to do. He let himself be bustled over and along until the wisp found who it was seeking. The woman looked at Idris, a sad etched deep into her face, and she held that wisp to her ear, and a light flickered softly in her eyes. "Once," she whispered, and the wisp quivered with delight. The memories spun from the woman's fingers and rippled through the air. A forest blossomed from the dirt and pulled free a storm. The people stopped. They smiled, and together they watched as a thunder of colours rained down from the sky. And when the woman's fingers stilled, there was just a splash of happy in her words, and the sad on her face was not as deep as before. More days passed, and more wisps flew in on the evening wind. Onces were whispered, and rememberings released. Idris tasted the pull of the moonlight, explored the soft scent of new knowings. He felt the rumbles of the earth and the tremble of stories from 1,000 kingdoms. And then one evening a wisp appeared that didn't wriggle or flutter or flit. Instead, it settled itself at Idris's feet, and Idris wondered, was this wisp meant for him? And he waited, and he waited. But no memories appeared. Idris had lived his whole life in this small, small world. There was nothing else to remember. Then Idris held the wisp close, and slowly his ache was calmed, and a seed of understanding began to grow deep inside his heart. For you see, Idris's wisp wasn't a memory, it was a promise. Idris felt his feet begin to move and his arms begin to shake, and he danced free his promise, sending it shooting from the stars and bright soaking the dirt. And the people stopped, they smiled, and together they felt the promise of a dream. And Idris lifted his hand and let the wisp catch on the wind. He watched it wing higher and higher over the fences to where people had forgotten how to welcome wide field. It splashed in the rivers and it danced in the trees. It carried with it the heartbeat of a song, the colours of rain, the scent of new knowings, and the tremble of stories from 1,000 kingdoms. And the promise grew stronger with each person it touched. And soon it whispered, someday. Wisp, The Story of Hope by Zana Fralin and Graham Baker-Smith. I'm going to pause. Please turn to your neighbour. Do you feel that gives you hope? And what's the story exploring for us or you? What are you thinking? Over to you for a quick conflab before we move on. Okay, I'm going to move us on. But I suppose I wanted to set the context with a piece of narrative that can lift, but also a piece of narrative that's conveying a message about the memories that Idris has, as it were. The other people in the camp, in the refugee camp, have lots of memories of the past that shape their current and build their future hope. And he can create hope out of the future that's going forward. So both work, the identity shaping of the past and the identity shaping of the future. And we're in privileged position in initial teacher education to be able to capitalise on both with our student teachers, their past identities as readers and thinkers and people in the world, and to help shape their future forwards. Let's think, though, in the first stretch then, that potential of reading for pleasure itself. Student teachers need to be research informed, we know that, and we therefore need to be research informed. And if some of this is not new to you, my apologies, but in order to mould our future teachers, we need to be conscious of the research evidence around this particular space. So, reading for pleasure is extensively studied now across the last 10 years, mostly based on PISA and Pearls because they're open access databases, then researchers can mine them. Yep. And we've seen very strong evidence from longitudinal studies, both of these, Sullivan and Brown and Sun et al., that reading for pleasure impacts on cognitive development. It's not a causal, it's correlational, but it's hugely large-scale studies, very significant. Sun's just came out this year, and early reading for pleasure, as they argue in that very strongly evidenced, is longitudinally associated with advanced brain structure, with higher levels of cognitive performance in adolescence, and indeed better mental health. So catch up for academic performance and catch up for my sense of well-being, being encapsulated for those young people who choose to do it. But of course, we can't make them, can we? We can't tell them to read for pleasure. We have to entice, we have to invite, and therefore it's easier to invite you to a party if I'm already part of the party, which means I may need to develop as a reading teacher rather than a student teacher who doesn't read much and never did and doesn't like it. Do you see where I'm coming from? Yeah. Okay, so that's first strand, cognitive development. It's also hugely and extensively linked to higher comprehension and related attainment. There are studies across the world, including your own here, from the last Pearls studies in Ireland and in Northern Ireland, but right across from Korea, Finland, Turkey, you name it, and many, many more. I've just finished a very extensive review, 50,000 words around this space. So, yeah, you can be really reassured that this is an extensive international phenomenon. You're going to get better comprehension if you're choosing to read regularly outside school. You're going to get richer vocabulary too, aren't you? Look at the language from WISP. I don't know whether you noticed the trio, the people stopped. they smiled, and together they listened to the blazing bright heartbeat of a song, or whatever it is. You get that trio 3 times through the text, repeated refrain like a verse, but pushing the message home. Richer vocabulary, richer word hoards are given to those young people who choose to read. There is no question about it. McGuillan's work is a meta-analysis of this field, and he argues that it's much more impactful to just be a reader than to have vocabulary teaching every week. Yeah? But he does say, let's give up on vocabulary teaching because we don't have enough young people who are choosing to read. So vocabulary, comprehension, cognitive development, indeed related to all of these, is that whole notion that reading for pleasure provides that kind of bridging function from the oral discursive language we participate in towards the academic language, towards the sub-technical vocabulary that's needed to advance your understanding in Key Stage 3 and beyond. We also develop, of course we do, wider general knowledge through reading. So we learn more about the planet we're on, we learn more about Shackleton's adventures, or indeed we learn more about being a refugee by Kate Milner's My Name Is Not Refugee, or Elizabeth Laird's A House Without Walls. As we read fiction, not just non-fiction, as we read fiction, we absorb and understand more prior knowledge which widens our understanding that we can then bring to any given particular focus that we're engaging in school. Lots of evidence around that too. In fact, for example, Sugar and Dreher study there 56,000 young people in the States, 11-year-olds, and there's a relationship, not causation, but a relationship between those who are reading for pleasure most avidly outside school and those who achieve most highly in the humanities in school. Yeah? Not in English comprehension tests, but in understanding the wider general knowledge that they're being asked to deploy. And then, of course, there are strong studies, aren't there, that focus on the social, emotional and relational benefits of reading. We saw in lockdown, as the National Literacy Trust highlight here, so many young people who voiced the view that reading gave them time out. In fact, we saw reading for pleasure spiking in the National Literacy Trust surveys during lockdown because there was more time to read and more space to read, and therefore I could breathe out and step away from the possibly uncomfortable, fearful, stressful situation with mummy and daddy at home and what's happening in the wider world, and read and lose myself in a book and feel safe and escape. I've just finished a new study or new analysis, we haven't published it yet, on reading and well-being with Year 5, 9-year-olds, and it's fascinating how much they use reading as a tool to support their well-being. Mum and daddy having a row downstairs, I go up and read, not just to get away, but to get away. Yeah. And I mean, we didn't ask them about well-being at all, and we get evidence upon evidence, these very keen, avid readers, how they use it. And then you think, well, what about all the children who aren't then keen and avid and don't have a book to step away from? So they're listening to that row and they've got no tool except perhaps their own phone, to go onto the net or whatever, to then meet more, rapid internet connections. Do you see what I'm not against the digital, I'm just saying there's a very different kind of, one's a calming world living space and the other's a frenetic magazine style space, potentially, unless they found something on the net that's going to take them there. So it is supported in diverse ways, and we're seeing increasing numbers of studies. For example, Mack and Fancourt, no, they're not, yes, they are on there. A Mack and Fancourt study highlighting how at the onset of adolescence, those young people who are going into secondary school are more comfortable if they're readers. They can cope with secondary school better because they have that greater sense of self-assurance and well-being that means when it's tough in secondary suddenly, it's different. I haven't got one teacher, I can hardly cope, but if I'm a reader, I'm coping better. And again, longitudinal study highlighting this for us. So last strand, highlighting the power of affective engagement and how that leads to improvement in empathy, making social actions in the world, making wise choices, and being able to develop understanding of others' contexts and cultures. So lots to summarise there very quickly. Reading for pleasure makes a difference. Choosing to read. And at one level, why wouldn't it if children are going to read regularly outside school? Even if I only read 10 minutes a day, well, 7 days in a week, that's 1 hour 10. So I'm reading 1 hour 10 and I'm choosing to do it. So an hour and 10 minutes, I'm giving myself more lessons. So which child in the country isn't going to benefit from an hour and 10 minutes extra education every week? Education they gave themselves because they chose to participate in it, and we didn't require it or set it as homework. They chose to engage in that agentic fashion. So as the OECD and many others have highlighted, the will to read influences the skill and vice versa. They operate in a bi-directional relationship. The reading for pleasure, therefore, gives me hope. Yeah? And therefore we need to begin to think, or we already are, how might we inform and enable our young people in student-teacher education, and indeed teachers themselves, to understand the power of this potential, and then begin to say, how can we entice, develop, engage? One of the concerns, though, or at least one of the positives, as the OECD highlight, is that engagement has a potential to address some of our more challenging social justice issues, as it were, inequality of opportunity. For example, some of our young people are living in what Newman and Moland have called book deserts. They're living in a space in the world where they don't have access to resource for financial reasons to buy books off the net. They have no local library, or the local library is so far away they can't get to it. And the local bookstop, if there is bookstores, are very impoverished in areas of high socioeconomic challenge. So the difference is, for some young people, where they are literally living means they are living in a book desert as opposed to others. So there are injustices there. There are certain injustices in relation to classroom practice. Those teachers who don't understand this agenda and haven't explored it fully, why many, as we've seen in our own research, we wrote a paper, Amelia Hempel-Jorgensen and I, called The Pedagogy of Poverty, building on others' work in that space clearly, but looking in relation to reading for pleasure practices, where these four, no rudeness to you, might be less experienced readers. So my expectations of you are low. And I wouldn't read WISP to you because you might not get it. But I'll give you these simple ones over here, or your brown box readers, okay, you four? You can go over there and you can choose from the brown box. It's not very motivating, but it's about your level, so you better go and choose from that. And so I'm being rather rude and kind of characterising, but you see where I'm coming from? We saw practices like that in schools that were identified as doing good job reading for pleasure. And I went there in the classroom I was in a particular town where we were 4 case studies across the whole week. I went there excited to go and see. I'd interviewed the head teacher, I'd interviewed the teacher who I was studying, year 5. And by about 15 minutes into the first day, I thought, how did we get here? What are we doing here? Why did we did the interviews? Why are we in the school? It's meant to be exemplary. And what we could see was exemplary was window dressing of reading for pleasure, positioning of reading for pleasure. There was a boat in one classroom and sheds and all sorts around the place. But the reality of the interaction, the affect, the relational, the social was completely absent. And it was almost the antithesis. Yeah. So the literal window dressing of the space was very powerful, really impressive. And that meant the local authority had suggested them. And then when we talked to them, yeah, they could talk it too. The head could talk it, lots of book talk. But the book talk wasn't you and me blethering like you just did about WISP. It was answering questions from Miss. And then Miss saying, get your vocabulary book out now. Azure, let's get the word azure down. Let's define it. And sometimes I was actually not frightened for my life, but so uncomfortable. I was like this, And at one point, I nearly interrupted. And as a researcher, you all know we don't do that. But I nearly did, because this teacher berated a boy because his parents hadn't signed in the book. Yeah, and because if you don't keep the reading record up, we might not win the Readers of the Week on Friday. And the Readers of the Week on Friday got bag of popcorn, and they could watch a movie. And I'm like, this is horrendous extrinsic motivation of reading when we know that what matters is intrinsic. Reading because you're involved, because you're curious, because you want to know what happens next, or you're interested. Now, I'm not trying to decimate a particular classroom, although it sounds like it, but I'm trying to say it's more complex. It's not just about, tick a few things in, cover the place in lovely, fairy lights in the reading corners and we've solved our business, as it were. No, much harder than that, as we know. So it is an issue that we need to address. And we also need to recognise, don't we, that despite very high standards in England and in Northern Ireland and in Ireland in particular, the Republic of Ireland in particular, for standards, in relation to reading. We do see that our countries are caught up in the decline internationally and the gender challenges internationally. So if we look at these in the last PEARL study, which is Progress in International Reading Literacy Study for our 10-year-olds, Northern Ireland, 24% of the young people responding reported not liking it, whereas the international median was 18%. And if we look in the Republic, we see 23% reporting not liking it. So more children than across the 57 countries and nation states that took part are not enjoying reading. So we've got this kind of, we can do it, but we don't choose to. Yeah? The can, but don't readers, as Gemma Moss called them years ago. I can do it, miss. And when you test me, I can do it, but I don't do it. I mean, heaven's sakes, get a life, I don't want that, thanks very much. So there are challenges for us as educators between the push and the pull of the performative agenda in relation to schools, literally in schools, and initial teacher education. Can I just ask you to turn to somebody next to you and just say, what are one or two of the challenges that you see in your context for fostering young people as readers and the young people, the student teachers, fostering the even younger, the kids in schools? Over to you for a quick couple of suggestions on the challenges. Some of your challenges are reflected on the screen here. During lockdown, when I was doing various keynotes about this, I asked the question always and then collected them and have a rather fascinating figure. The most challenging element of the figure that I could tell you is that more teachers told me during lockdown the problem is that one there that begins with P and ends in U. I thought they'd tell me it's money. I thought they'd tell me it's time. No, it was about parents. Parents don't do it. It was othering, which is quite concerning. Yeah? An othering of the agenda too. Well, parents should take responsibility for this. In New Zealand, they've just moved into a new draft national curriculum that includes reading for pleasure. We've had reading for pleasure in the English national curriculum since 2014. Yeah, it's been mandated. You're required to enable children to find pleasure in it. Although, as I said before, that's a bit challenging. But at least it's now coming into the New Zealand curriculum, being recognised as a tool for social justice. Previously, it was very clear in New Zealand, it was the expectation, if they don't read for pleasure, it's the parent's problem. Yeah? Now it's beginning to say, actually, it's a professional problem too, a professional responsibility to address this space. So if we don't want inequality of opportunities, we need our student teachers to develop their sense of understanding in this space. And what I'm trying to kind of argue is just summarised here, really. My social justice stance is fuelled by the discrepancy between those many educational theories that honour, like Louis Moll's work and others, children's diverse funds of knowledge, what they bring to this agenda, what are their identities, what are they really reading, what are they wanting to read rather than what we're requiring them to read or expecting them to read. And then educational practices, such as we saw in that study, that reduce success to a set of measurable indicators. So are we measuring only the attainment? Now, I'm not trying to suggest we measure the pleasure, but we need to develop the pleasure and document the behaviours, the attitudes, the dispositions of those who are the keen readers. So I would argue we need to explore translating the lived experiences into future realities and to mobilise the personal dispositions and attitudes our student teachers have, and to mobilise the personal dispositions, and they may be negative, and attitudes that our Year 6, Year 2, Year 9 have, as it were, that can therefore nurture volitional reading. If you take a child who is 11 or 12 and they have been doing no thank you for the last few years, no thank you, that kind of, no, thank you. There's nothing to do with me. I don't want it. I'll play your game. I'll do your writing. I'll do your tests. But I'm not a reader. Just, go away with your idea. If we've got a lot of those and they're 13 years old and they started that pattern because they perhaps weren't skilled in the early stages of reading, because there was a book desert and perhaps they weren't read to and they didn't show in any way they needed to be supported as readers, or nobody supported them, perhaps they did show that, then they were 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. They've done 9 years of not being a reader, of rejecting the identity position of a reader. That's hard work to shift that one. And our student teachers who are coming in, also, some of them have negative attitudes. And so we have to start from where they are, not from where we want them to be. Yeah, which is hardly news to any of us, but you can see what I'm digging for at least, and honouring their realities and their lived experience to build on. So let's focus on those student teachers as readers. And here I reach a point where so many of my slides are crossed out that I don't know what's coming next. So we'll just go with the flow. You must have been there, she said. Okay, yeah, I think it speaks for itself. Reader identities do matter. How teachers conceive of reading and how they construct notions of reading in their classrooms has a significant effect on our young people's identities as readers. And we know that identities are fluid and they're going to shift depending on context. We also know they're shaped in interaction. That's how we develop our identity, through the way you view me, through the way we then interact with one another. So and indeed, through the kind of models that your teacher education program for your student teachers models about reading itself and the community that they're invited to participate in. So if we look at studies of student teachers as readers, some have even gone as far as to call them illiterate, which I think is flaming rude. But there we are, that's a matter of opinion. So it's that bad. Yeah, there are plenty of studies that show that students rarely read. And I've tried to order these in date order. Hopefully I've been almost accurate, because it's showing that over time, this is still a problem. There are many studies that show student teachers view this as instrumentally only, view reading as instrumentally. Yeah. You're reading in order to get better scores. You're reading in order to be able to understand and respond, not in order to lose yourself and think about the world, not in order to have a debate on Saturday morning about horrendous situation in Israel, as it were, or indeed the floods in Middleton, not in order to think and engage, but in order to get through, yeah, and tick it and be done with it and then get on with my life, which is separating schooling and. Then we see studies that also show a diminishing desire, which is quite worrying. And the SCAR one is in Finland, which is surprising too. Diminishing desire to connect to literature. You know, I'll read other stuff, but not stories. Thanks very much. Poetry? Not even thank you very much, even there. You know, not even know the name. And then many, Garces Pascal there in Singapore, highlighting, and indeed Jen Farrers in Scotland, highlighting that many student teachers see it as utterly irrelevant. It's nothing to do with being a teacher, whether I read. Yeah. So my identity's got nothing to do with it. Get real. Give me the skills and the competencies I'm meant to deliver, and then I'll be the teacher you want me to be, rather than see this as part of who you are, and part of who you are is also part of who you're going to be as a teacher. So a group of us in OU worked with some of our Open University Reading for Pleasure partners, and we worked on a study which involved 11 different HEIs, and we gave them a survey. This is more recently, in 2021 they filled it in, but we started the planning earlier. We looked at quant and qualt analysis using corpus linguistics, because we had lovely colleagues from the linguistics department working with us. And amongst the questions, we began to explore what were their identities and in what ways have their past experiences as readers shaped their current understandings. So the space we're in relation to that study, and that's a brilliant book if you don't know it, so I'm using both as a kind of notion for the moment, but also a book recommendation, that we found that predominantly they were rarely readers. They reported reading about a month or less. Yeah? So that's the category where we drew the line. So 70% read monthly or less. But what we found was that actually, surprisingly, they weren't unenthusiastic about it. They weren't negative. And when we look back at the previous studies, like Applegate, for example, they said they don't read regularly, so they're unenthusiastic. They don't like it. And then assumptions were built into some of those earlier studies that said, if you don't do it often, then you don't like it. Yeah. Well, there are some things in my life that I don't do often, like stay in a fabulous hotel like this. But it doesn't mean I don't like it. I love it. You know? So hang about, let's get some, you know, so there's a kind of, it just came to my mind. I was thinking, well, I rang my husband last night and said, you ought to believe it, you should have come. Side the point, so back to the point, being far too personal. But then we began to find that these young people have barriers. They have honest to goodness barriers that seem not unreasonable, actually. Now, one of mine for staying here would be cost, potentially, and distance. But some of theirs were related to cost, but were related to, I've never really found books since I read X, Harry Potter, say, very interesting. I haven't found another one that did the same for me. A lot of them talked about commitments. When we were interviewing these young people, we did the survey and then we did follow-up interviews, and we were like, whoa, there are so many commitments and pressures on their lives, and many of them are handling young children at home, and they're still training at one of the universities in England trying to be a teacher, as it were, PGs and undergraduates, as it were. So it struck us as perhaps we were asking too much, you know, that we need to start from another starting point and not call you rarely readers, but call you potentially very keen readers. But we just need to work in this space to enable you to journey. So if we look at some of the research evidence around what makes a difference to our positions as readers, identities as readers, plenty of evidence suggests that early positive experiences make a difference. So if we can break this change, is why I feel there is hope. If as teacher educators we can enable more of our young people to become reading teachers and fully developed, then they'll, when they've got children or already got children, introduce not only in the classroom but to their own children that pleasure in reading and see that move on. We also saw the very significance of reading role models in the home, and male as well as female reading role models. So there was some hope. What we also saw, I was expecting the next slide to be something else, but it isn't there, so we'll just move to this one. Maybe it's coming in a moment. So I was going to just ask us to think for a minute about our own reading histories. This is a picture of a place I know very well. In Scotland, my parents own a little tiny place up there in Alton Dew. It's got 2 bedrooms, as it were. It's minute. And this is the view. Well, it was the view a few years ago. There's a caravan site now, but anyway, let's not go into that detail. But for me, 10 minutes, glory be. Okay, for me, reading there was, normal. My childhood. We went there every summer. That's what you did. You went there and you read. I mean, my brother didn't read. He went fishing. My sister didn't read. She went looking for flowers with mum. Massive. I didn't care about flowers or fishing. I just read on my own. Don't care. That's lovely. It was fantastic, in fact. Yeah. I'm going to pause and ask you to think about where your childhood memory of reading is. Over to you for a quick conflab while I move on. I'm just sharing there on a screen some of the many things I've read while there in Scotland. And look at this, wonderful. Is anybody else in the room prepared to admit? Good, there's a couple. You remember reading Jackie? It's so wonderful. It was actually named after Jacqueline Wilson, for those who know Jackie Wilson. She was the girl in the shop, in the office, when they were making that magazine. And as she openly tells people, they said, we want to name it after a sort of young person. Like that lass who makes us tea. What's her name? Jackie. Let's call it Jackie. Which is wonderful, isn't it? But anyway, there are some visuals. And you remember those, anybody? No, maybe not. Far too many young people in the room. It's too bad, really. And there are some visuals from inside, the different kind of... Now, when I was given this through actually The Observer, did some stuff on a Sunday, giving away, this is dated from the period I would have read it, I knew I'd seen that page. Do you mean? I actually remember going, and that feeling, that kind of sense of affective connection. Does that make sense? To my past. And so what I'm highlighting here is our reading histories are different. This is a teacher I've been working with, Steph. Her reading history is utterly different. Yeah? She had MSN and MySpace in her reading history. More contemporary text, but also digital text, which I didn't have available to me in my own space. So our childhood reading histories may have been influenced by Dogger, and look at this lovely picture of the real Dogger that was lost in Shirley Hughes's home, and then she wrote the story about it. But those childhood reading histories are part of us, and we bring them to teacher ed. We don't have to spend weeks on them, but if we can open up around them and begin to understand, what are they telling us? What are they telling us when we talk? That was the hardest time to interrupt, you might observe. Mirror up. Yeah. So you've had 3 times to chat to one another so far. That was the hardest because it was you. It wasn't your response to, it was you, your lived experience, your memories. And that, of course, makes a difference. So we need to honour those spaces and begin to say to one another, isn't reading social? Isn't it affective? Isn't it relational? And if we understand more about reading, then we can tempt the young people into this relational community of engaged readers, rather than into you need to read on because we've got to get on to the next book, or I'm reading this book to you because I chose it. Well, why should I choose it? Excuse me. Yeah? Why don't we choose and vote for the books in this classroom that we're going to hear Miss read for pleasure? So what I'm trying to highlight here is the personal and the professional. And I want to explore highlights and possibilities, really, about finding out more about your student teachers' attitudes, dispositions and identities as readers, exploring their expertise and their life experiences. Some of them will have very negative. A colleague of mine, Emma, has been working with student teachers on PhDs on this, and she's been interviewing, embeddedly negative student teachers. Now, that isn't impacting that teacher's capacity to teach literacy and reading for pleasure. It is impacting her capacity to teach reading and maths and RE and geography right across the curriculum. It's impacting her capacity because she doesn't want to read the books that go with any of that and just sees it as, well, you get out the topic book, don't you, and you give it out, or you copy a bit and you borrow it from the internet and you land it on the page, and then we do the work from it. rather than engaging with the issue of pollution within that particular text and finding some narratives that will go with pollution that enable my class to read more about pollution in order to widen their prior knowledge when we study it. We also need to think about the mentors that our student teachers are working with too. What kinds of role modelling are they offering in the context of the classroom? Are they only doing window dressing, or are they doing more than? And is that making a difference? And then we need to examine the consequences of placement. You can see when young people go out onto student placement, where they come back in and they're surprised by X or Y, and they love the activities. They want to go towards the activity. But I'm sorry, I want them to understand the principles and the dispositional shifts and the relationships in the classroom, not just which 6 activities seemed fun and the kids liked it. Well, that's not education. That's doing activities that are under the banner of reading for pleasure. I'm anti-activities under the banner. I'm pro-research-led understanding of the nature of reading that makes it more authentic, more relevant, and more real to the young, as well as those involved. And indeed, for example, one teacher here, Steph, same lady, said when we'd been doing our own reading history, she said, I'm going to do that with the class. I hadn't thought about it. So she offered her class the opportunity to find 3 books at home or 3 books on the net they'd read before in the past and bring them in on the Monday. And one of her class came up and said, Miss, I've made a slide on it, but I haven't done 3. I can't do 3, and you were wrong to ask 3. I've got 9. And I think that says so much about their relationship that she could push back against Miss's activity. And Steph said she thought she'd spend about 20 minutes on it, but in fact it took nearly 2 hours with all of them discussing. And she went back down to some earlier years classrooms and got some boxes of books, and the kids were delighted to revisit what they had read, who they were. Now, I'm terribly conscious of time, so I'm going to just flick through a quick argument now, yes, I can see that, about teachers' textual knowledge. I've done many studies of this, and these 2 just show you Roald Dahl's pretty dominant, and indeed in children too. So the bottom one is children, 2021, we published it in 2022, but the children's. So if we only, as readers, read from a small collection, then we're creating, constraining the children's access to. In England, during a survey in lockdown, Dahl was dominant in the survey. In the States, we found that, or Conradi Smith et al. Found that the average date of the books that the teachers were reading aloud in 2021 was 1997. That was the average date. And they'd removed things like Swiss Family Robinson. So they're ancient, these books. Over 1,200 teachers, or 1,000 teachers in that survey. And when we asked 854 student teachers from that study what 6 authors they'd recommend, well, I don't think you're going to be surprised. We're also working alongside some Finnish colleagues, so we asked them too. And the student teachers in England, this was the collection. The student teachers in Finland, this was the collection. Now, if we look at another visual representation of that, you can see the top 11 authors in England, not books. They didn't name the Congo Caterpillar, they named Julia Donaldson. Do you see what I'm saying? So those were the top 10 on the England and the top 10 named authors. And there were 2 overlapping. I'm sure you can guess one of them at very least, which was Roald Dahl, James and the Giant Peach, 1961. That was written. You're celebrating 20 years, James and the Giant Peach, which was read by the highest percentage of teachers in the Centre for Literacy and Primary Education Study in England during lockdown, 1961, 62 years ago. And Harry Potter. So what I would argue is we collectively across different countries and nation states have our own popular childhood canon of kids lit. And why shouldn't we? Those are the books we were introduced to when we were 6, 7, 8, 9. And if we were lucky to be introduced to them, they formed part of our repertoire. There's nothing wrong with having a cultural canon from your childhood. But what is wrong is if you don't widen it. If you don't develop a more diverse canon that enables your young people today, who are born many years after James and the Giant Peach was written, to develop there. So we get all the paraphernalia that goes with that helps, that persists that canon, but we need to take responsibility for developing our student teachers with regard to their identities as readers and future teachers, to understand the construction of those reading repertoires and the very big gaps in them and bring critical literacy to bear within that, and with reference to widening contemporary texts. Where's the diversity in terms of LGBTQ agenda? Where's the diversity in terms of own voice stories in relation to social cultural backgrounds? A whole wide range of different diversities that exist now that weren't recognised or written about before and need to be recognised and understood as we move on. So my question to you would be, just before I close, how might contemporary and diverse texts be woven more fully in your teacher education courses, not, I'm trying to say loudly, in English only, but right through, so that we're dealing with really new big issue texts, but that help young people, the student teachers, then know books they could then go and use in the classroom that are contemporary, not from our own childhood pasts, as it were. So a challenge to you to think through that one, and to begin to say, in initial teacher ed, we have a professional, social and moral responsibility to expand our teachers' repertoires of, or student teachers' repertoires of children's literature and other texts, because then they can, in a more effective way, advance educational equality, both through the text they're using and the actions they take. Now, I am conscious that is reaching now my third strand, and we have 5 minutes. It's called bad planning. I feel sure you've been there. I'm going to ask you just to tell somebody next to you what 2 messages you've got, and I'm going to flick while you're doing that towards the end to get to the final kind of 3 or 4 slides. So over to you for a quick conversation. What message are you getting so far as we move through this? Okay, colleagues, I'm going to move us on. A few last slides just to try to summarise. I apologise for massively over-preparing. One quick example of developing reading teachers would be to be more authentically engaged ourselves. So I'm happy to stand here and say to you, I didn't finish Wild Swans by Yung Chang. I know that many of you have read it and think it is a literary masterpiece. I'm afraid for me, it didn't work. I just got lost with the Chinese relatives, and that's not to diss the book. It's just to simply say, Teresa, Cremin, couldn't find enough connections in it. It didn't work. And I'm allowed to say that because I'm me and I'm a reader. And we need to encourage our student teachers to voice that so that they can, in the context of the classroom, explore young people's rights as volitional readers. To give up on some books, not every book, but to give up on some books so that we can explore and understand that. As this young man says, I once started reading Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. I got to page 56 and I stopped. The reason I stopped was because he had good description, but it took him forever to get to the main plot. There was no action, the pages were big and the writing was small. I think I'll enjoy it when I'm older. I thought I'd enjoy it as much as The Hobbit, but I was wrong. Now, what we know and understand, although it's funny, at one level, what we know and understand about metacognition is that this young person is consciously aware of his choices as a reader and has made the choice not to continue to engage. Yeah? And even though somebody might have leant upon him, nudged him, expected him, mummy might have wanted him to. So our reading teachers, or indeed our reflective geographers or mathematicians, are thinking about reading or maths or geography in the real world and their engagement with it, their desire to go on walking holidays to see Oxbow Lakes or whatever it is, as it were, to reflect upon that process and then to say, so what are the consequences? Can I hold a mirror up to my practices and then turn around and say, how might I reflect some of the consequences for my young people so that reading or maths or geography becomes more real and less school? Of course we're going to deliver the school curriculum, but we want them to volitionally engage in being fascinated by Oxbow Lakes or whatever it is, or indeed reading for pleasure. Do you know what I mean? And so in order to do so, we're trying to balance that agency and desire alongside the expectation. And my hope is that reading for pleasure gives us a space in which we can begin to do that and then apply it more widely. So characteristics of reading teachers, I would argue, have an openness to learn about, could be reading, could be maths, yeah? Seeing pattern in maths, valuing pattern in maths, commitment to developing their knowledge in that space and their own identity. And then have a pedagogy which is responsive to that, does not put on one side the pedagogy for reading instruction. Of course, that must happen. Not suggesting this overplays it. It's about a balance between providing instructional skills and understanding at the same time as fostering volitional understanding, so that I'm constantly reflecting and responsively reacting my pedagogy to the young people. On our Reading for Pleasure website, and I'll pass around some things later, there are some examples of teachers who worked at just this and who've tried to find ways in classrooms to become those reading teachers. And on the site too, we have loads of other stuff that helps because it's a site for the community, not a site for researchers to tell teachers what to do, but for a site for Research and Practice Coalition to dialogue around these spaces. And they've helped us, so many of these teachers, understand the challenges that they've met in so doing. We also have partnerships with 36 universities who are outfacing Reading for Pleasure work in order to develop reading teachers, and we are working with St Mary's, Donna Hazard at University of College in Belfast. But if anybody else is interested, do blether to me. I can explain what that involves. We have student-teacher reading ambassadors in those universities, not in everyone. They choose whether they want to do it, but where they are. Some student ambassadors work with us across the year as an AU RFP team to try and give them the confidence to position themselves as reading teachers and help their student teachers too. And then we run reading teacher groups. Volunteers run them all over the country and abroad. And we don't have many here. So we love some more, because it would be a space in which we give structure and support, but a space in which your teachers, current teachers, professional development, Mark back to this again, but it's voluntary attendance, 5 sessions across the year, and it's very much nationally structured but locally owned. And we run a Reading for Pleasure Quality Mark with the UK Literacy Association too, trying to celebrate where schools have developed those communities and develop volitional reading where children want to read, do read, and love reading. So that was my trajectory, and I think I'm trying to highlight the personal in the professional. Stephen Ball has shown us how, the performative agenda can take away teachers' souls, as it were, or at least reduce that kind of sense of personal engagement in the process. I'm trying to revisit that space, and as Fielding argues, rehumanise the curriculum through coming from where we are and who we are, and meeting our student teachers and our young people where they are too. I hope that was useful to you. Thank you.